Okay, hopefully we're recording. Friend is here. Um, so a couple of days ago, I made a video talking about how I had been exposed to HIV a couple of years ago, and I am currently in the process of getting tested and making sure I'm still okay because I've been feeling sick. And this morning, I received a comment that was threatening me to use my possible status to frame me for a crime, to incarcerate me for something that I haven't done, to basically criminalize me, specifically because I might be sick. And this is something that has happened to people in the past when HIV was so heavily stigmatized. And so I wanted to try to bring awareness to what the disease actually is, how you contract it, how it's changed over time, and why it's not something that people should be demonized for or put in prison for, saying, oh, you have HIV, well, I'm going to have you put in prison for the rest of your life so you can't hurt anybody. I'm going to frame you for a crime and have you locked away because you're sick and I'm afraid. That's the response that I've gotten. And it's a very scary response, and it's unfortunately a very real response. So I wanted to try to educate. I'm not looking down on you for threatening me like this, or for viewing me like this, or for feeling this way. It's an extremely scary virus. It does unspeakable things to the body. And it's perfectly reasonable to be afraid of somebody. But you can educate yourself so that that will be less of a scary thing. You don't have to be afraid of being friends with somebody who has HIV. You don't have to be so mortally afraid that you want to have them locked away so that you'll be safe from them, because it's just not that type of disease. But I found this video from the Biographics channel called the HIV/AIDS Plague of the 21st Century, and we're going to watch it together. But I'm going to take my face off so that I'm not in the way of this fella who is going to be speaking to us.
In the early days of the 1980s, an unknown stalker was doing the rounds in the US, preying mainly on young homosexual men. One after the other, they fell victim to illnesses considered to be quite rare until that time.
I'm going to raise the quality here. Sorry, I watch everything in the lowest quality possible, but since I'm sharing it with others, I should raise that up a little bit.
Patterns began to emerge, leading to the discovery of a new infection, leading to the syndrome that would be dubbed the plague of the 21st century. A plague that would carry with it the stigma of behaviors considered by some to be morally reprehensible: HIV. In today's episode, we will trace the origins of the disease from the first publicized cases in the US to the later research pointing to the first outbreaks across the Atlantic. Along the way, we will discover the truth behind the man still known as Patient Zero. HIV and AIDS were not easily identified at the start. It took time for medical researchers to piece together the clues that would lead to the identification of a new illness. The first recorded event in that trail of clues was a morbidity and mortality report published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on June 5, 1981. This report described 5 cases of a rare type of pneumonia, Pneumocystis carinii, or PCP. This is a type of infection of the lungs caused by the fungus Pneumocystis jirovecii, which leads to difficulty in breathing, a high fever, and dry cough. The patients were young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. All of them showed signs of severe immune deficiencies. Within days, doctors across the US submitted reports of similar cases to the CDC. Less than a month later, on the 3rd of July, the New York Times published an article about the outbreak of a rare cancer. 41 gay men in New York and California had been affected affected by Kaposi's sarcoma, an abnormal growth of small blood vessels that manifests itself with firm pink or purple spots on the skin. It can become life-threatening when it affects the internal organs. More and more homosexual men fell ill with rare conditions. Very often, they were associated with immune deficiencies. In January of 1982, some of the patients and their friends and families founded Gay Men's Health Crisis. This organization would become the first non-profit, community-based HIV service provider. But at the time, they didn't know what they were fighting against. Very soon it became clear that whatever was infecting US citizens was not only targeting homosexuals. On July the 16th, 1982, a CDC report featured 3 cases of PCP in heterosexual hemophiliac men. Hemophilia is a genetic condition which prevents blood from clotting. In the 1980s, patients suffering from it required frequent blood and plasma transfusions.
I'm going to break in real quick. I kind of have the opposite of this, where my blood clots too much. It's probably what saved my life when I was a really bad cutter, because seemingly no matter how deep or bad I went with my cuts, it would always clot and close itself up.
Around the same time, the first cases of a new disease were being recorded in sub-Saharan Africa. In Uganda, this disease was nicknamed Slim Jim as it caused massive weight loss among its victims. Later that year, the term AIDS was first used to identify the new disease. It was the 24th of September when the CDC released the first definition of AIDS, a disease at least moderately predictive of a defect in cell-mediated immunity occurring in a person with no known cause for diminished resistance to that disease. Gay men were in a group among which the disease was most prevalent, but it quickly became apparent that they were by no means the only victims. In January of 1983, the CDC recorded the first 2 female patients. They were partners of men living with AIDS, which suggested a sexual transmission of the disease. Firstly, in May of 1983, 2 teams of researchers found the cause behind this new illness. The first was a team headed by Dr. François Bar-Senoussi and Dr. Luc Montaigne at the Pasteur Institute in France. They isolated a virus which they believed was responsible for causing AIDS, which they called LAV, or lymphadenopathy-associated virus. Later that year, Dr. Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute in the US cultivated LAV specimens in his lab, identifying it as a retrovirus. This is a type of virus which can insert a DNA copy of its genome into a host cell in order to replicate. In June of 1984, Dr. Gallo and Dr. Montaigne held a joint press conference announcing their discovery that a retrovirus was responsible for causing AIDS. The French doctor called it LAV. Gallo called it HTLV3. They later changed the name to human immunodeficiency virus, HIV.
Ralph's is not paying me. I'm not going to share their ad.
The acronym AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome and is the advanced stage of the infection caused by HIV. HIV is a rather aggressive virus which targets the cells of the immune system, making a person more vulnerable to other infections and diseases, which are called opportunistic infections. A healthy individual can contract HIV by contact with certain bodily fluids from an infected patient with detectable viral load. Most commonly, this happens during unprotected sex or through the sharing of injection drug equipment. A person who is HIV positive is considered to have progressed to AIDS when the number of their white blood cells of the CD4 type falls below 200 cells per cubic millimeter, or regardless of their CD4 count, when they have developed one or more opportunistic infections. Opportunistic diseases most commonly associated with AIDS, which can often lead to the death of a patient, include bacterial infections like salmonella, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Less well-known consequences are fungal infestations like thrush and PCP. However, the weakening of immune deficiencies brought about by HIV can also lead to the onset of certain types of cancer, for instance, lymphoma and Kaposi's sarcoma. As of today, there is no cure for HIV. However, certain treatment regimens, known as HAART or highly active antiretroviral therapy, can help patients live with HIV without it degenerating into AIDS, and we'll get into those a little bit later. Without this therapy, people with AIDS typically survive about 3 years. Sadly, if they contract a dangerous opportunistic illness, their life expectancy falls to about 1 year. Patients who are HIV positive can live for 10 to 15 years without any noticeable symptoms, and even if they manifest, they can be easily mistaken for those of a less serious illness like flu. When HIV degenerates into AIDS, common symptoms include rapid weight loss, diarrhea, fatigue, memory loss, and depression. Again, these symptoms are not exclusive to AIDS and can be related to other illnesses. That is why the only certain way to diagnose HIV and AIDS is to get the appropriate test to avoid an uncontrolled spread of the infection. The most common ways through which AIDS is transmitted are unprotected sex and the sharing of needles by drug users, but there are other, less common avenues. For example, a mother can pass HIV to her child during pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. There have been cases of health workers being infected when handling HIV-contaminated needles or other sharp objects, particularly if they are not utilizing the recommended personal protective equipment. A patient may also receive a transfusion of blood or plasma from a donor who is HIV positive. Nowadays, this risk is extremely low because of the scrutiny that blood donations receive, but there had been many cases recorded in the early 1980s before rigorous testing was put in place. Finally, there is an extremely low risk of contracting HIV via oral contact. For example, if an individual is bitten by an infected patient, or if two partners, both with bleeding gums or mouth ulcers, share a deep kiss. HIV absolutely can't be spread by insect bites, physical contact, air, water, saliva, tears, or sweat. HIV can affect anyone, regardless of sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, gender, or age. However, certain groups are at a higher risk of contracting HIV. The records of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show that in the US, certain demographics are more likely to get this virus. According to 2018 CDC statistics, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men accounted for 69% of all new HIV diagnoses. The next largest category was heterosexuals, accounting for 24% of new cases, followed by injection drug users at 7%. Records show that the incidence of new cases disproportionately affects ethnic minorities. For example, African Americans are about 13% of the overall population in the US, and yet they account for 42% of the newly infected. Hispanics are 18% of the population, but account for 27% of the HIV positive. People who identify as white are 70% of US citizens, but they are just a quarter of the overall incident patients. All things considered, gay African-American men are the category at highest risk of contracting HIV, representing 25% of all cases. So let's go back to the 1980s. It was becoming clear to medical professionals and even part of the general public that this new disease favored certain groups defined as the 4 H's: homosexuals, heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, and Haitian immigrants. The first advocacy groups started to take shape in 1983. On May the 2nd, people with AIDS staged their first public demonstration in San Francisco. In the following months, patient groups issued the Denver Principles, a charter stating their right to be involved in policy decisions and to be called people with AIDS, not AIDS victims. On the 22nd of November, the World Health Organization held its first meeting to assess the global impact of AIDS. By this date, at least one case of the disease had been reported in each region of the world. It took another couple of years, though, before AIDS fully entered the public consciousness. First, it was thanks to an Indiana teenager. On June the 30th, Ryan White, a boy living with hemophilia, was denied admission to a local school. He had been infected with HIV from a blood transfusion. Ryan went on to speak publicly against the stigma and discrimination that many AIDS patients experienced. The other event was the death of Rock Hudson on the 2nd of October. The legendary Hollywood actor died of AIDS, leaving $250,000 to help set up the American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR. Fellow actress Elizabeth Taylor acted as national chairperson for AMFAR, which gave a further boost to the disease awareness efforts. The first few years of the epidemic and their impact, especially on the gay community, were recorded in the 1987 book And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz, a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle. The book introduced a real-life character, the gay Canadian flight attendant who had succumbed to AIDS on March the 30th, 1984. Thanks to his good looks, charisma, and field of work, the flight attendant traveled across the country, having a string of sexual encounters along the way. Apparently, in a typical year, he could have up to 250 one-night stands. While researching his book, Schultz came across the cluster study published in the American Journal of Medicine. With this study, CDC investigators sought to draw up a map of sexual encounters among several people with AIDS. The study featured a diagram illustrating this network of relationships. At the center of the largest cluster, responsible for directly infecting 8 patients, this paper had identified one person as patient 0. According to Schultz, this patient was ultimately responsible for introducing HIV and AIDS to the United States. For years after Schultz's work had been published, a medical dictionary still refers to patient zero as an individual identified as the person who introduced HIV in the United States. According to CDC records, patient zero, an airline steward, infected nearly 50 other persons before he died of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome in 1984. That airline steward was the Canadian flight attendant we discussed earlier, and his name was Gaten Duga.
Oh wow,
Gaten
I didn't know that they knew exactly who the first person was. So that's actually really interesting. Making sure this is still recording.
Duga was born in Quebec City, Canada on February the 20th, 1953. He worked for a period as a hairdresser in Toronto before moving to Vancouver. There, he realized his dream of becoming a flight attendant, working for Air Canada. While on duty, he frequently traveled across Europe, the Caribbean, and the US, with his favorite destination being San Francisco. Gaten loved to attend the annual Pride Parade, but he flew to San Francisco as often as he could, enjoying many of his sexual encounters there. Gaten was 26 when he first displayed symptoms of ill health, in this case, swollen lymph nodes. A year later, in 1980, brown spots appeared under his skin. Gaten had them checked with a biopsy, which revealed that he had Kaposi's sarcoma. Gaten had to undergo several cycles of chemotherapy, with all the side effects that go along with that, from inconvenience to agonizing pain. Despite losing much weight and all of his hair, Gaten continued to sport a cutting-edge look, wearing fashionable headbands and designer clothing. By this point, the clinical community had linked Kaposi's to the new disease targeting homosexuals. It was referred to as gay cancer. In a letter to Ray Redford, a former lover and friend, Dugas described his mental state as he tried to learn more about the disease and to keep its symptoms at bay. He wrote, "My mind is finding peace again. You are right. I must upgrade my attitude towards a full recovery. But you know, there is always this storm that strikes you when less expected." The CDC started interviewing gay men with Kaposi's sarcoma and soon realized that at least 4 of them had slept with Gaten. Duga took part in this cluster study too, cooperating eagerly and volunteering plenty of detailed information on the names and addresses of his previous partners. The CDC made it clear to Gaten that the new deadly illness may have been spread sexually. According to Schultz, in November of 1982, Gaten Duga was even confronted by a San Francisco public health official about his sexual habits. Duga was asked to avoid having sex to prevent further spreading of the disease, but he flatly refused. It was his right, he said, to do what he wanted with his body. By that time, Dugas had moved to San Francisco permanently, and he frequented the local bathhouses looking for new partners. His success streak was such to rouse the jealousy of other gay men in the area. Some even conspired to have him evicted from the town. It was because of behaviors such as this that Schultz harshly branded Dugas as the Quebecois version of Typhoid Mary. Eventually, Dugas left San Francisco and resettled in Vancouver. His body was now...
I'm going to pause here because I want to quickly talk about the similarities between this guy they're calling Patient Zero and the man who has put me at risk. Because, like with Patient Zero, they told him, you need to stop having sex. We think that it's being spread through sex. To protect other people, we need you, personally, you, to stop fucking around. And the guy said, no, I like it. The man who put me at risk went on to have at least 4 other girlfriends after me, one of which he got pregnant. He told me that he always had a backup woman. He was never single. So it's very strange to me to hear that Patient Zero refused to stop after almost being infected by somebody who knows they're sick and refuses to stop. Also, the person that has put me at risk, they weren't gay. They were white, straight, and had it was a drug, IV drug situation.
consumed with opportunistic infections, the most serious one being PCP, the fungal pneumonia. The infection progressed inexorably. Gayton moved back to his native Quebec City, where he passed away on March 30th, 1984, aged just 31. The cluster study was published some weeks after his death. All that remained of Gayton's lust for life was a circle at the center of a diagram. It was connected to 8 other circles: LA 3, 6, 8, and 9, and NY 3, 4, 9, and 15. Gayton's circle was marked by a 0. The only thing is, it was not a 0. It was the letter O. The cluster study marked its participant by location. Gayton Dugar had been recorded as out of California, or simply O for short. Randy Schultz's work had many critics, with Cambridge historian Richard Mackay among them. Mackay points out that Schultz had misunderstood the letter O for a number 0. The diagram of the cluster study was not supposed to illustrate what may have been the epicenter of the pandemic in the US. It was intended to find a link between 2 outbreaks of Kaposi sarcoma and other opportunistic illnesses, one on the west coast and the other on the east. Gayton, O, and a certain SF1 were the links between east and west. But Gayton just happened to be placed at the center. Some of the other interviewees in the study were as promiscuous, if not more so, than Dugar, but they could not or would not provide as many details as the Canadian steward. Hence, his circle, marked with a O, appeared as more interconnected to other men. That's why it was easier to represent him graphically at the center of the diagram. Schultz's editor, Michael Denany, admitted that the two had overplayed the responsibilities of Dugar in the epidemic. In order to make And the Band Played On more appealing, they painted Gayton as the villain of the piece, Patient Zero, the Typhoid Gary, if you like, who had introduced HIV and AIDS to the US. The intention was ultimately noble: increased circulation of the book to raise awareness about HIV, as well as the stigma and indifference suffered by gay people with AIDS at the hands of authorities and the public. But in doing so, the book created the false myth of Patient Zero, scapegoating Gayton Dugar. Even if the Canadian man was not an actual Patient Zero, Schultz's book makes it clear that he stubbornly continued to spread HIV through unprotected sex. But that claim is disputed as well. The CDC first stated that AIDS was sexually transmitted in January of 1983. Gayton's discussions with the CDC and the San Francisco health official took place in 1982. Dugar's behavior was certainly promiscuous. He definitely lacked caution, but it wasn't as brazenly irresponsible as portrayed in the book. He was not consciously infecting as many men as he could. What really matters to us is that HIV in the US did not start with Gayton. It most likely cannot be traced to one single individual, and most likely did not start in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Considering that HIV can take as long as 15 years to display symptoms, many people could have been infected long before then. In October of 1987, an article in the Chicago Tribune reported a story about tests run on samples belonging to a teenage male from St. Louis. The samples tested positive for HIV, and in fact, the individual had died from an AIDS-like condition in 1969. A Nature article in 1990 found that tissue samples from a British sailor had also tested positive for HIV. He'd died in Manchester from PCP in 1959. More clues pointed to an earlier origin of the disease and to a location many miles away from North America. In 1983, a joint Belgian and American research trip to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, established that a similar disease to AIDS was widespread there, affecting mainly heterosexual men and women. In 1987, medical journal The Lancet found evidence of HIV-like infections in Central Africa dating back to 1959. Researchers were closing in on the place of origin of this plague of the 21st century. It was sub-Saharan Africa. One of the most accredited theories on the origins of AIDS is the one dubbed Cut Hunter theory. One of the proponents is microbiologist Jacques Pépin. In his 2011 work, The Origin of AIDS, he proposes a likely travel route from Central Africa to North America and the rest of the world. HIV likely originated as a pathogen in primate populations, most probably chimpanzees. Late-stage infected chimps developed a syndrome called SID, simian immunodeficiency. Sometime in the early 1920s, the virus jumped species. This is when the virus somehow relocated from an infected ape into the bloodstream of a human. The most likely candidate would be a hunter whose open open wounds were infected by the chimpanzee's blood, the cut hunter, in other words. In the 1920s and 1930s, French Equatorial Africa and the Belgian Congo enjoyed close trade and employment ties, meaning that any infected individual could have traveled across highly populated centers via short boat rides, spreading the disease further and further. Pépin, in fact, found evidence of a disease similar to AIDS, causing an outbreak in a railway camp in French Equatorial Africa in the 1920s and early 1930s. HIV may have spread via sexual contact, but also via iatrogenic transmission. These are infections caused by doctors reissuing unsterilized needles. Travelers and sailors visiting Central Africa may have contracted HIV as early as the 1950s. However, Pépin was able to establish with more certainty a link between Zaire and the Caribbean. During the 1960s, several thousand Haitian were recruited to work in Zaire. It is possible that many of them became HIV positive and carried the infection back to their country. From Haiti, HIV made its way to North America via two avenues: the transnational blood industry and sex tourism. A study published in Nature in October 2016 ascertained that blood and plasma collected from Haiti by New York Hospital was indeed HIV positive. Our Cambridge historian Richard McKay argues that Haiti was a popular destination for American gay men looking for sexual liaisons. From these two entry points, the virus gradually spread to hemophiliacs, heroin users, and homosexuals. And of course, there are scores of potential Haitian immigrants jumping the Gulf to the United States, the four H's that we already mentioned. Through the effects of Pépin, McKay, and other researchers, it is clear now that the whole concept of Dugar as patient zero is more or less debunked. The first outbreak of what could be called AIDS dates back at least half a century before, and it went completely undetected before it swelled into what appeared to be an unstoppable pandemic. Since the beginning of the epidemic, 76 million people have been infected with the HIV virus, and about 33 million people have died of AIDS-related infections. Luckily, advances in medical science have made it possible for HIV-positive patients to live much longer than ever before. What used to be a fatal disease has now become a chronic illness. It can't be cured, but it can be managed through the regular use of antiretroviral drugs. The first treatment indicated for HIV was approved by the FDA in 1987. In July of 1996, the 11th International AIDS Conference established HAART as a breakthrough approach, leading to a drop in morbidity and mortality. Advances in other disease areas have also made it possible to prevent or treat the symptoms of the most common opportunistic illnesses. However, HIV and AIDS are far from being completely defeated. At the end of 2019, about 38 million people were estimated to be living with HIV across the globe. During that same year, 690,000 people died of AIDS. 300,000 of them died in Eastern and Southern Africa alone. Despite some advancements in treatment rates, sub-Saharan Africa is still the region suffering the most from HIV. And amongst the infected, about 3/5 are women and young girls. According to UNAIDS, the Joint United Nations Programme on HIV/AIDS, the progress of the HIV crisis is related to the low supply of antiretroviral therapies. Naturally, this is a situation which may be exacerbated by the concurrent pandemic we are now going through with COVID-19. But UNAIDS identifies another set of reasons: gender inequalities, lack of access to secondary education for girls, scarcity of sexual and reproductive health services. There's also the ongoing stigma which prevents HIV-positive people and at-risk populations from seeking treatment and preventative advice. Now, we've mainly focused on the American HIV story, but here at today's conclusion, I'd like to bring things closer to home. In 1987, millions of households in the UK received an information booklet on the risks of HIV and AIDS. The booklet was tied to an effective TV ad campaign, and it used frank language on the matter of transmission via sexual intercourse. The tagline of this Department of Health campaign was, "Don't die of ignorance." It drove the point home. During any public crisis, knowledge and the responsible behavior that grows out of it are really key. As you've seen today, ignorance about the disease caused millions to die. But ignorance, and its brother prejudice, can also isolate, condemn, and taint the memory of those who don't deserve it. So I really hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that.
Okay, so, and that last bit that he touched on is exactly why I wanted to watch a video explaining the disease, the origins, the history, because education is the most powerful tool that we have when it comes to the fear of illness and the stigma and the prejudices that come with things like this. The only way we can really fight it, aside from with medication and with research, is with knowledge and understanding and getting that knowledge out to people so that everybody can hold that knowledge. And there's not groups of people that believe that you should be incarcerated for being sick so that other people will be safe. It's a lot. There's a lot to discuss with it, and I just wanted to try a little bit to educate the people that are currently threatening me using my possible status.